If you want to turn in your Old Testaments to Genesis 32, I'll be reading verses 24 through 28. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was stained as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And he said, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." And he said unto him, "What is thy name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for thou hast striven with God and with men, and hast prevailed."
In Genesis chapter 32, if you want to go ahead and turn your Bibles there, we have a very interesting story. A man wrestling with an angel sent from God. And not only did the man wrestle with the angel, but he prevailed. And there may be a lot of questions about, and there are actually a lot of questions about this passage which may not have answers provided in Scripture. But there's also some answers, I think, to questions that are rarely asked as well about this text. But let's get some background. You know, we can go back in the book of Genesis to chapter 25, and we see two brothers being born to Isaac and Rebekah. And they are twins, and one is born, and the other literally is hanging on to his heel as he is given birth to as well. And his name reflects that, a heel grabber or supplanter as it sometimes is used. But as we come forward into chapter 27 of Genesis, we see that these two brothers they're at odds with one another. And the parents have made the terrible mistake of having a favorite. Isaac's favorite was Esau, the firstborn. Rebekah's favorite was Jacob. And so there was this tension between these brothers. In fact, to the point that when Esau was starving to death, Jacob didn't just feed his brother because his brother was starving. He connected giving his brother food with making his brother sell his birthright for a bowl of soup. I know sometimes we talk about Esau in that situation, but we don't want to miss what Jacob did either, because that's not how a brother should act. Jacob later, in chapter 27, he deceives not only his brother, but he deceives primarily his father into giving him the blessing that was to be given to Esau. And Esau clearly becomes very angry, and Jacob has to leave. And he flees from the land of his father and his family, and he goes to the land of Haran, and God blesses him there. You know, it's interesting though, because Jacob deceived his father, and he goes to a land, and almost immediately he is the victim of a deception, as Laban deceives him and gives him his daughter Leah instead of his daughter Rachel in that marriage. So he becomes a victim of the very thing that caused him to come to that land there in chapter 29 of Genesis. And God blesses him with 11 sons through Rachel, and Leah and their handmaidens. And we see that in chapter 30, and he is also a very wealthy man at that point. Jacob leaves and returns to Canaan. But as he is returning, he knows that he's going to have to face his brother Esau. He hasn't seen his brother Esau now in 20 years. Since that time that he deceived and he took from him what was going to be his. The book of Hebrews says that Esau wept over it, and yet it was gone. And he could not get it back. And Jacob heard from messengers that came and said, Esau's coming. And he's got 400 men with him. You know, he could have left that last part out, right? That might have helped just a little bit. Here comes Esau, and he's got 400 men with him. And so Jacob becomes very afraid, and he fears him greatly. And he prays fervently. And he begins to do a series of actions that are predicated on this fact that he has this great fear of Esau. He first takes all of the group that is with him and he splits them into two groups. And he says, well, if he attacks one group, the other group can run away while he's destroying the first group. And then he begins to send gifts. He's at the Jordan River. And he begins to send gifts across the river to his brother Esau. He sent 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewe lambs, 20 male rams, 30 milking camels, and their colts, 20 female donkeys, 10 male donkeys, and he sent those in 3 waves. He's trying to appease Esau, and with the servants that he sent with them, they are to tell Esau, these are gifts from your brother. He's giving you all these things. He's trying to earn the favor of his brother. And last of all, almost as if he's trying now to garner the sympathy of his brother, he sends his wives and his sons, his 11 sons, across the Jordan River to where Esau is at. And it is at that moment that we come to the story that we're talking about this morning. Everyone has crossed the Jordan River. Jacob is left alone on that east side of the Jordan. And a man seems to come and attack him. And he wrestles with him throughout the night. Now we know Jacob was a strong man. He was, even if we go back to some 20 years earlier, in chapter 29, he rolled that stone away from that well by himself. And that was something that usually took a group of shepherds to do. But he was a strong man, and his strength is seen in his wrestling with this man. People often ask the question, who was this that he was wrestling with? Well, Jacob states that it is God. The book of Hosea will refer to the one that he wrestled as both an angel and as God. And when we talk about angels and we talk about, God, a lot of times the language is used synonymously. Some people believe that it may have even been the pre-incarnate Jesus himself. We're not clear. But we do know that it was a heavenly being, that's for certain. And as an angel, he's clearly not using his supernatural abilities. We know that angels have supernatural strength. We see that in other places in the Scriptures. He seems to be wrestling Jacob on equal terms. And you can almost see that as a shadow of Christ later coming as a man. Even though he's God, he lowered himself. He emptied himself of things that made him, of powers that he had as God, so that he could be a man. And here is this man wrestling, and he's not exercising what an angel can do with his supernatural strength, but instead is wrestling him on equal terms. But he could not overcome Jacob. And at daybreak, it seems that the angel does then use his supernatural powers, and he touches his hip, and it dislocates. And so now Jacob is in this terrible pain, but yet, even in that, he still would not yield. And the angel tells him, let me go. It kind of gets humorous at this point, because you got this angel, and he's got a hold of him, and it must be some kind of wrestling grip, right? Because he cannot get out of it. The angel says, let me go, and Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. I want you to bless me. And so he does. But he also at that time changes his name. He tells him that his name is Jacob, but then he said, which meant supplanter or heel grabber. And it was a name that characterized the deceptive type of life that he had lived up to this point. This is a point in which Jacob changes. That he really becomes a different person in his narrative. And that's often what name changes did. When a name is changed in the Bible, it usually means that person's life is changing at that moment. Think about Abram. You know, Abraham began as Abram, but yet when the promises of God came in, God said, now you're Abraham. As far as going forward as his descendants. A man named Simon came up to Jesus, and Jesus said, that's not your name anymore. Your name's now Peter. Because he was going to have a mission that was going to change his life from that day forward. So these name changes are times in which people's lives were changed. It characterized the life change. And he says, your name is not Jacob any longer. Your name is now Israel. So a name that at one time had the idea of being deceptive has now been changed to a name that literally means Prince of God. But the angel defines it with the idea that you have striven with God and with men and you have prevailed. So his strength is kind of brought into play in this, but he is now a person that is a changed man. The angel blessed him, and this is a change moment for him. And I want us to think about three things that we see in the life of Jacob as a result of wrestling with God. First of all, I want us to note how God is identified prior to this wrestling match. In chapter 28, verse 13, where Jacob has fled, he has seen the angels going up and down the ladder to heaven. It says, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the land on which you lie. I will give it to you and to your descendants. In chapter 32, and verse 9, as he's praying, as he's preparing for this facing of Esau, in his prayer, he prays to the God of my father and the God of my grandfather, the God of Isaac and the God of Abraham. And so we see God addressed in these times as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. But I want you to note, he doesn't say my God. It is not what we see later in the New Testament when Jesus talks about that He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Chapter 33 and verse 20. After the events with Esau and Esau's reception of him, Jacob goes and he builds an altar. It says, then he erected there an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. And that name means God. The God of Israel. Not talking about the nation, folks. Don't miss this. Your name is no longer Jacob. Your name is now Israel. God. The God of Israel. See, things have changed. Before, it was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. Now, he comes out of this situation and he's on the other side of this wrestling match and he says, no, He's the God, He's my God, the God of Israel. Me. And there's a personal aspect to this. Folks, we have to personalize God in our lives. He must become our God. Not someone else's God, not our parents' God, not our grandparents' God, our God. That He's mine. That He's in control of my life. Jacob said He's my God. And it did Jacob no good for God to just be the God of his father, to be the God of his grandfather, to be the God of even Abraham and Isaac. It did him no good unless God was the God of his life too. We spent a lot of time in one place that I was at. And we look back over the years, a couple of decades, at our youth and what was going on with them. And how many had remained faithful. We had percentages going back many, many years. We began to realize that they were not percentages that we liked. And I think a lot of congregations, when they look at things like this, they find numbers they don't like. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how we wanted to approach that. How do we change that? How do we turn that in another direction? And one of the things that we came to understand is that we have to work harder to enable our young people to have a faith that is their own. Not their moms and not their dads, but their own as it is found in Scripture. Because mom and dad's faith only pretty much lasts as long as mom and dad are there. But your own faith you take with you. And it began to make a difference. It began to make a difference in the retention because young people were leaving with a faith of their own. It was their God, my God, not my parents' God, not my parents' faith. So we see that here with Jacob, that he moves on from just being the son of someone who it was their God, it was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and it becomes his God, and it changes his life in profound ways. So we need to make that effort in our lives. Sometimes we have to wrestle our lives to this place where our lives belong to God and not to us. You can also see here that suffering can aid in making God our God. You know, sometimes the struggle of faith makes us stronger. Oftentimes what comes easy is often taken for granted or not cared for or devalued in some particular way. And yet a struggle will add value to something. And it will add value to our faith. I know we want everything easy. Just give it to me and give it. I don't want to have to work hard at it. I just want it to be, rolled out there and just all I got to do is pick it up, kind of like manna on the ground. But they didn't value the manna that God gave them every day because it was so easy. David said in Psalm 119 and 71, "It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I may learn your statutes." See what he's saying there? He says, it's good that I suffered. It's good that I went through some difficult stuff so that I might make you my God. That I might learn what you want. That you'd be the God of my life. Though in pain from that, I'm certain that dislocated hip had to hurt. We even see that he's having a hard time walking the next day. Jacob was driven, even in that pain, to seek the blessing of God through this struggle of wrestling with this angel all night. He was broken, so he turned to God. Psalm 51 and verse 17, David addresses this when he is writing his great psalm about the forgiveness that he had received and he sought from God as a result of his murder of Uriah. And he says, "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise." And Jesus even goes there in the Sermon on the Mount that blessed are the poor in spirit, those that understand that they're broken. Blessed are those that mourn that brokenness in their lives. It's not easy. It's not easy to look at my life and to see that it's broken, that I need something that I can't provide. I need God. And yet when Hosea, I mentioned to you a while ago that Hosea had mentioned this event with Jacob. In Hosea chapter 12 and verse 4, it says that Jacob wept. This is after his hip was dislocated, that he wept and he sought the blessing. So he is in pain, he is weeping, and he's still going, "Bless me." It made a difference in his life. Going through this night, going through the mental pain of that day, as he was about to face Esau and feared that moment. Finding God is a process. It's a process that involves and requires the destruction of self. Destroying self so that God might rule. And it's a wrestling match, for certain. There's going to be times when tears are going to come to our eyes. There's going to be times when it hurts. But it is something that is necessary. It is something that is difficult. But at the end of it, you get a new name. Just like Jacob. Your name's no longer Jacob, it's Israel, Prince of God. And when we have our wrestling match with self and God, and we come out on the other side, as painful as it may be, we get a new name. Christian. Son of God. We look at God differently. My Father. My God. And it changes our lives. Last of all, this morning, I don't want you to miss the similarities in this story and a story that Jesus tells in His ministry. Think about Jacob with me for just a moment. Here's a son who mistreated his father, mistreated his brother, and then went away to a far land for a period of time. Someone who later decides to return home, but has a very different perspective in regard to life. The person who it says in Genesis chapter 33 and verse 4, listen to this. This is when he crossed the river himself, and Esau sees him, that brother that he's been so afraid of. Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him and wept. Do you recognize that storyline? Because in Luke chapter 15 and verse 20, prodigal son who had mistreated his father went away into a faraway land, came back with a different perspective, and as he's approaching home, just looking to be a servant because he doesn't think his father will take him back as anything else. Obviously not understanding the person he's returning to very well. And yet that text there says the exact same thing, that the father ran, just like Esau, that he fell on his neck, just like Esau, and that he kissed him, just like Esau. There is a real prodigal story in this story of Jacob and this return to his brother. Redemption, the reuniting of two people, the father and the son in the prodigal parable, Jacob and Esau here. Redemption lies on the other side of this wrestling with God. Wrestling with God in our lives, wrestling our lives into submission and giving our lives to God. And Jacob found forgiveness from the one that he had wronged, just as the son and the prodigal found forgiveness from the one that he had wronged. Remember what he said? I have sinned against you, Father. I just want to be a servant. So we see a parallel between these two stories. Maybe we all, I guess maybe would not be the right word, we all, at some point in our lives, need to wrestle with God. And I'm not saying that's going to be easy. We're going to have to wrestle and determine if we're going to be in control of our lives or whether we're going to let God be in control of our lives. It's a my will versus His will battle. Jesus wrestled it. Jesus wrestled in the Garden of Gethsemane with Himself and God. He, obviously His will was not to go to the cross. He said, not my will. Clearly, His will was not, at that moment, what the Father's was. Not my will, but your will be done. So He wrestled with it. He wrestled with what He wanted in in opposition to what God wanted. And folks, it was painful. And it was hard. And he prevailed by giving himself to God. And it was a hard decision to make. And it's a decision that each and every one of us have to make. Change who we are through the struggle. Just as the psalmist said, it's good to be afflicted so that I'll understand how much I need to know what God has to say. And as we come through that struggle, He will be our God. And we will have a new name. And we will have a new life. And how great is that? When you decide His will, not mine, really decide that. Well, that's easy to say. It's a whole other thing to be. When you finally wrestle that into your life, and it's truly God's will, that when that's really where the rubber meets the road of a faithful Christian. When what you want is in conflict with what God says. What you choose right there. That makes all the difference. That shows what you really are. Whether it's His will or your will be done. It is our prayer this morning that it is always for all of us His will, not my will, be done.